And how many of you have heard it? God's unconditional love. Well, I picked up that book by this famous author whom everybody's supposed to be reading, and I thought I better read him since everybody else is. And I read this. Jesus came to show us the mother love of God as distinct from the father love of God in the Old Testament. And there he is, the most popular writer of preachers today. Jesus came to show us the mother love of God as distinct from the father love of the Old Testament. There is a new Bible come out in America called the inclusivist version, the anti-sexist version. And in it, all the way through, God is Father, Mother. And Jesus is no longer son of man, he is child of human being. And a reviewer in America, reviewing this new Bible, which is now the official version of the mainline churches, said this: the devil must be laughing her head off. And that was a very clever remark, because the devil is still male in that Bible, which reveals the whole game. But people want God to be a mother, not a father. You see, a father disciplines. A father should be the one who punishes children. And people don't want a God like that. They want a mother. A nice, kind, soft mother who'll welcome them. In fact, I was watching a religious program on television, but in this program, the interviewer was talking with a bishop who is in charge of revising the Church of England doctrine, bringing it up to date. And she said, "Are you going to make many changes?" "Oh, yes," he said, "quite a few." She said, "Are you going to change the way we think about God?" He said, "Oh, yes." She said, "In what way?" And he said, "We're going to try and help people to understand that God is weak as water." And she said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, the world is in a mess, but God can't do anything about it. He is looking to us to put it right for him." And she said, "Do you think this will bring a lot of people back to church?" He said, "Of course. When people realize how much God needs them, they will come back to his aid." And she said, "Well, how do you imagine God?" And he said, "Well, I think of a large family in which there is a grandmother, and her love holds the family together while they all go out and do their work and put the world right." And the interviewer, who is not a Christian, said to the bishop, "But I thought God was a father, not a grandmother." That's when I got angry. You see, when you come to Jesus, you find that he taught the fear of God. One of his most famous statements is this: "Don't fear those who can kill you, and do nothing more to you than that. Rather fear him who can throw body and soul into hell." And he's not talking to sinners. He's not even talking to Pharisees. He's talking to Christian missionaries just before he sent them out to proclaim the gospel of the kingdom. He kept telling his disciples, "Don't be afraid of the wind and the waves." He didn't say, "Peace, be still." He said, "Get muzzled." And the wind and the waves ceased. Jesus could talk to the weather as if it was a misbehaving puppy. Why are you afraid of that? But then they began to fear him and said, "What manner of man is this? What kind of a guy is this?" In the book of Acts, the main evangelism at first was among a group of people called God-fearers. That's a technical term for Gentiles who had attached themselves to Jewish synagogues but hadn't become Jews. Cornelius was one, and there were many others. And it was among those people that Paul had his greatest fruit in his missions. Those who already fear God to some degree are much easier to talk to about the gospel than others who don't. I'll be very practical. I've found it a good deal easier to preach the gospel in Southern Ireland than in Northern Ireland. Yet Northern Ireland is supposed to be more Christian. But there is a fear of God. It borders on superstition. But there's a genuine fear of God in Southern Ireland, which you don't find so much in Protestant countries. It is far easier to preach the gospel to those who fear God. Like a Philippian jailer, he was full of fear, and he was converted. Fearing God is the beginning of getting the truth of the gospel across. It says in Acts 9, the church multiplied and edified, living in the fear of the Lord. And I just had a real sense as I drove here. There will be no revival in Stoke-on-Trent, no great move of God, no turning to the Lord, until there is some living in the fear of the Lord. I'm convinced of that. You can try every gimmick, every method, every evangelistic. You can get big evangelists here. Until there is the fear of the Lord in people, you're not going to get very far. That's the missing factor. And I shall be saying later that the reason there's no fear of God out there is because there's so little in the church. Fear is infectious. It is caught. That's why mobs can do crazy things with a football match. Once fear spreads, very quickly spreads. And the fear of the Lord would spread quickly, if there was any to spread. Move on to the epistles. The epistles of the New Testament are all written to Christians. And they're full of the fear of the Lord. Oh, but Christians shouldn't fear the Lord, should they? Well, if they don't, who's going to? Can't expect those who don't know God and don't have any connection with Him to fear Him. It's got to begin with those who know God. And that's why Paul says, when he's saying the whole world is in sin, he summarizes it like this. He said, there is no fear of God in their eyes. That's what's wrong with society. No fear of God in their eyes. But then he moves on to Christians. He says, work out your salvation in fear and trembling, because it's God who's dealing with you. Work out your salvation. God has worked it in, but we're to work it out. And how will we do that? What will motivate us to work it out in our lives, in our world, in our society, in our churches? The answer is, work it out in fear and trembling. For it's God who's working in you. We're dealing with God. It's He who's working in us. And we're to do it with fear and trembling. You know, the early Friends, as they're called now, were called Quakers. Do you know why? Because when they came to church, they quaked. They trembled. The fear of the Lord gripped them. They knew it was God who was working in them. They feared Him. We'll answer the question why in a moment. Live your lives here in reverent fear, says Peter. Wives, submit to your husbands. Why should we? Because of fear of the Lord. That's the motivation for it. Submit to one another in the fear of Christ. And the book of Revelation is packed with the fear of God. Indeed, there's one point at which the people of the world, from the great to the small, from the kings to the slaves, tremble in fear and beg for an earthquake. They cry to the mountains, fall on us and hide us from the face of God and of the Lamb. They are terrified of the eyes of God and the eyes of Jesus, so terrified they want an earthquake to swallow them up. You know, I was talking to someone who was in the Indian earthquake. Do you remember the big earthquake in West India? I heard an amazing thing, actually. A large Christian missionary organization had called together a conference of workers, Christian workers, in that very area at the center of the earthquake. And when it began, they feared the Lord, not the earthquake. And they cried to the Lord, not because they feared the earthquake, but because they feared Him. And they were on the first floor of a building, and the whole building collapsed. But the floor on which those 120 workers were gently went down onto the ground, and not one of them was scratched. But it was because they feared the Lord. Didn't feel the earthquake. They were different. Well, let's leave the Bible behind now, except to point out that cowardly believers don't inherit the new heaven and the new earth. They go to hell. Just for being cowardly. Not for fearing God, but for fearing other people and fearing events. So let's come to the church now. There is no fear of God outside the church because there's precious little inside. Our worship reveals that. I want to be careful what I say, but we've got into user-friendly worship, which is casual, so we drift into it, or we say it doesn't matter if we arrive on time, we'll just be singing. And the casual and the informal has become the rule. You remember what I read from Hebrews 12? Let us worship God in reverence and awe, because our God is a consuming fire. Now, a consuming fire is not a nice little coal fire in a nice fireplace. That's what we like to think. We like to think of churches being warm. We give you a warm welcome. Have you heard that? Oh, we pride ourselves on being a warm fellowship here. Did you know that warm fellowships make Jesus sick? We should say to people, we give you a hot welcome here. We preach the hot gospel here. But we like a nice warm glow, central heating kind of warmth. But a consuming fire is not that. A consuming fire is destructive. Let me just take two experiences I've had. One was in Sicily. I'd been ministering in the town of Catania where there had been 200 murders in the previous 12 months. It's a lawless place, is Sicily, and the mafia controls it. I was there when 25 mafia got off scot-free because the judge didn't dare to sentence them for murder. It's a horrible place. But I took off in a British Airways plane to fly back to England, and Mount Etna, the largest live volcano in Europe, was erupting. And red-hot lava was flowing down the sides of it towards the villages. And the British Airways pilot thought we'd like to see it. So he flew right over the top, and he tipped the plane up, right up on one side, and I was on that side. And I was looking straight down into the mouth of the volcano. And it was just bubbling, boiling, a lake of fire. And I have to tell you, my heart was beating pretty fast. I was jolly relieved when he straightened up and flew us onto Heathrow. But I was in Australia at the time of a bushfire near Melbourne. And the fire was raging through the eucalyptus trees which are full of oil. It was raging at 60 miles an hour. And people were fleeing from it in their cars, and if they couldn't average more than 60 miles an hour, they were caught. And it was just racing through their bungalows, through the trees, the animals were being caught. It was frightening to see it. That's what a consuming fire is. And on that occasion as well as the volcano in Sicily, I remembered this text, God is a consuming fire. What I feel now in these two situations, I should feel when I go to worship. I'm in the presence of a consuming fire. God. But when did you last go to worship that had that sort of atmosphere about it? See, even the devil and the demons tremble in the presence of God, says James. Even the devils do. They know him. I'm writing a book at the moment and speaking tomorrow to the church leaders here about divorce and remarriage. Jesus said nothing about abortion. He said nothing about homosexuality. But he said an awful lot about the divorce and remarriage. He simply said anyone who divorces and remarries is committing adultery, breaking the commandment. And anybody who marries a divorcee is doing the same thing. But I'm speaking on it because divorce and remarriage are becoming as common inside church as it used to be outside. Are we just going to ignore the commands of Jesus?